biti na engleskom jeziku, pa ću samo ukratko da predstavim naše goste, i onda ćemo se ostalo uživati u prijavljanju. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Wachtel, who is here with us today. Wachtel is the president of the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and previously he was dean of the graduate school and director of the Rebecca Buffett Center for International and Comparative Studies at Northwestern University of Chicago. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. His academic interests vary, and they range from Russian literature and culture to East European and Balkan culture, history and politics and contemporary Central Asia. His most recent published books include The Balkans in the World History, Russian Literature, and Remaining Relevant After Communism, the Role of the Writer in Eastern Europe. Today's lecture is entitled Making Monoethnic States, the Balkans and Central Asia. So we'll hear something about the differences and dissimilarities between Balkans and Central Asia. And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Ja bih govorio srpski, ali nisam govorio srpski 2 godine i zbog toga mislim da ne mogu čitati vam predavanje na srpskom, ali ako imate pitanje na srpskom, možda. All right, so let's see, where should we start? Well, first of all, I should start by saying I'm at least originally neither an expert on the Balkans nor an expert on Central Asia, but I, by accident, have more or less become someone who knows something about both of them. And in terms of working on the Balkans, I wrote a number of books about former Yugoslavia, and I also wrote a history of the Balkans, and I'm going to refer to that history of the Balkans, the basic thesis of that book, and use that as a comparison point for Central Asia. I should also say, as far as I know, no one else does anything like this, because the number of people who actually know something about both the Balkans and Central Asia, as far as I know, doesn't exist. So what I'm going to say to you, I think, is rather new, perhaps, and hopefully a little bit controversial, not necessarily for those of you who are from the Balkans, but for people who are thinking about Central Asia, it's a little bit different than what most people say. So first of all, since I assume all of you have a pretty good idea of what the Balkans are, I'm not going to waste my time on that, but I am going to waste my time a little bit about Central Asia. So when we're talking about Central Asia today, we're going to talk about the 5 former Soviet republics of Central Asia. At various points in the history of Central Asia could have been understood as being much bigger. Some people want to call Central Asia the entire steppe land that goes from Mongolia, which is out here, all the way to Hungary, and everything in between, including Western China and northern Afghanistan and Iran. And at various points in the history of Central Asia, that made sense as various political structures covered that entire territory. In the present day, however, these 5 former Soviet republics have a fair amount in common. They also have a lot of differences between them. And because of the history of their 70 years or so being part of the Soviet Union, they are rather different than the surrounding areas, although there certainly are interesting connections between Xinjiang in China, northern Afghanistan, which you see right here, and northern Iran, but we won't talk about those today. So these 5 republics all became independent states by accident in 1991. None of them wanted to become independent. There was no drive for independence among the Central Asian republics, but when the Soviet Union fell apart, they had no country left to which they belonged, and all of them quickly became recognized international republics in the borders that they had during the Soviet period. And as you can see, especially down here at the intersection between Kyrgyzstan, which is in the orange, Tajikistan in the yellow, and Uzbekistan in the purple, those borders are pretty strange. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to come up with some kind of reason to draw them that way. In fact, they were drawn because this area here, where all 3 of them come together, is the most fertile by far farmland in all of the region. It's called the Fergana Valley. It's extremely overpopulated, and it's shared between Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Kyrgyz. And when these republics were created, I mean, there's still a lot of discussion among historians as to precisely why the borders were drawn the way they were drawn. It's not that Stalin just randomly put his pen on the map, as some people think. There was a fair amount of discussion, and it was decided to try, to some extent, to keep ethnicities together, to some extent to keep ethnicities apart, and to some extent to allow each of these countries to share in this very fertile farmland that all of them, or republics, all wanted to have some access to. Obviously, once these became independent countries, as we will discuss a little later, this kind of map becomes significantly problematic. And in the very long run will probably not remain looking like that, I would guess, but we'll get there. I mean, I could talk quite a lot about various things going on in Central Asia because I live there and I have the opportunity to travel to all of the Central Asian republics except Turkmenistan, which doesn't let me in. But I'm not going to talk about immediate political developments or immediate economic developments today. If people want to talk about those things at the time of questions, I'm capable of doing that, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but that's not what I'm going to focus on today. What I am going to focus on today are the processes of state and nation building that are going on in these 5 republics, and comparing them to what happened in the Balkans at a somewhat earlier period. Because in some sense you could call what's going on in Central Asia, I think, the Balkans in slow motion, if you want to. But again, people there don't exactly think about it in those terms, but those are the terms I'd like to talk about it in. So if we go backwards to about 1979, so the height of the Soviet Cold War, post-World War II Cold War experiment, the populations of all of these republics were something like what the populations of the Balkan states looked like towards the latter days of the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. As you are certainly well aware, empires are in some respects extremely good for minority groups, or at least because the imperial rulers care mostly about extracting taxes and they don't really care who's paying the taxes, it encourages subgroups to move around and live wherever they want inside imperial structures. And the imperial government also, the one thing it doesn't want is people fighting with each other, because that makes it difficult to collect taxes. So the one thing it does is try to keep some order among and between these groups. Doesn't mean that these groups like each other. Certainly the history of the Balkans would lead us to believe that despite the claims that once upon a time in the Ottoman period or the Habsburg period, all of these separate ethnicities lived in perfect harmony and happiness. In fact, as we know, they did not live in perfect harmony and happiness. They didn't particularly like each other. They didn't necessarily mix with each other any more than they had to, but they didn't kill each other because the imperial governments generally were not interested in them doing that and prevented them from doing so. So the Soviet imperial government can be understood rather similar, especially to the Ottoman government. The Soviets, the main difference though between the Soviet Union and the Ottoman Empire was there were a lot more Russians and Ukrainians and other Slavs than there ever were Ottomans. So the Russian colonization project, if we want to call it that, brought significantly larger numbers of people to Central Asia. And that's where I want to pick up this story. So in 1979, Kazakhstan, which is the largest of these republics, as you see, it takes up pretty much half of Central Asia. And by the way, we're talking about here a territory that's half the size of the continental United States and has a population total of about 50 million people, so it's a rather sparsely populated area. Kazakhstan itself is a total population of about 15 million on this enormous territory, making it one of the least populous countries in the world. I think after Mongolia and Canada, Kazakhstan comes in about third. So in 1979, the population of Kazakhstan was only about 43% Kazakh, ethnic Kazakh, and was close to 50% Russian, Ukrainian, German, and Jewish, and then maybe another 10% other Asian minorities. Kyrgyzstan, which is what I'll focus on mostly today, was just barely 50% Kyrgyz in 1979, and 33 to 34% Russian, Ukrainian, German, Jewish. The other republics had slightly smaller populations, but still, in none of the republics was the titular nationality more than about 65% of the population. So they were very strongly infiltrated, if you want to use that word, by outsiders, non-Asian, non-Muslims. They came in two basic waves, so, well, yeah, let's call it two. So in the 1930s, a lot of Russians and Ukrainians came to this part of the world to help build communism. And then during World War II, a large number of Russians, Jews, Ukrainians were evacuated from the areas that the Nazi Germany invaded and were packed off to Central Asia to help for the war effort. And after the war, many of them decided actually there was no place to go home to because their homes had been destroyed. Central Asia was nice and welcoming, and they stayed. So, and as is often the case in colonial states, the people who came from the outside occupied particular niches in local society, with the main difference being that in the Soviet Union there was something called korenatsia, which meant, quoting from the root word in Russian, means root, which meant that the local people were actually given high administrative positions. So in the Ottoman Empire that obviously didn't happen, but in the Soviet Empire, locals were, at least titularly, locals were the heads of the main administrative apparatus. They were the head of the local Communist Party. They were the head of all the various administrative things, but they always had a deputy who actually, in most cases, did the work, who was a Russian or a Ukrainian or some other non-Asian, non-local. And Russians dominated the sector of medicine, they dominated the sector of the professions, they dominated the educational sector, all through this period. Now, even in the Soviet period, from the late 70s through the late 1980s, there was some outflow of Russians. So the trends that I'm going to talk about today, demographic trends that I'm going to talk about today, started happening before the end of the Soviet Union. This is not exclusively a post-independence phenomenon, but it accelerated, as we will see, after the end of the Soviet Union. Now, again, if we go back and recall the history of the Balkans, I mean, the thesis of the book that I wrote about the Balkans, in some sense, was that Balkan history becomes what we think of as Balkan history, or what is the stereotype of Balkan history, when what was simply a fact, that there were lots of different people and different ethnicities living together on the same territory, became a problem. So when it was just a fact, it was a fact. I mean, there were these people, they were there. It wasn't something that was an issue. When ideas of the nation state imported from Europe showed up in the Balkans, and when states began to be formed, independent states began to be formed on the territories of the former Ottoman Empire and then ultimately on the former Habsburg Empire, then this became a problem. It became a problem because for the vision of the state that was prevalent among elites in the Balkans, borrowed from Western European models, an ideal state, again, as you're certainly well aware, and an ideal state should contain only members of a single ethnicity, and all members of that ethnicity should live in that state. Now, obviously, if you have lots of different ethnicities mixed together, this is a problem if you're going to try to create states on that basis. And if you want, you can look at the entire history of the Balkans from around 1800 to, let's say, the 1990s as a relatively slow but quite decisive process of solving this problem. As we know, solving this problem is a rather unpleasant and nasty business. It requires moving people around in the best of circumstances, either by cajoling, convincing, or forcing. It requires potentially assimilating them if they don't want to move, but they need to be turned into us, whoever we are, or it means killing them. Those are the three options, and all three of those options were quite widely practiced in the Balkan states, as again, I'm sure you're all well aware, with the result that by now, all of the former Balkan states are quite nicely monoethnic. That is, they look pretty much like well-organized European states with 90%, 85 to 90%, sometimes higher percentage, belonging to the titular nationality, and relatively small numbers of people belonging to minorities. Now, again, I'm well aware of the level of cruelty that it took to get to this position, but one can argue that it's what every single West European state did as well. They just forgot about the fact that they did it. And in some sense, as we will see in Central Asia, the incredible advantage of this approach is that it actually has been proven more or less to work. Whereas all of the other approaches that are proposed by people of well-meaning ideas have never been proven to work. The only examples that are usually cited by those people who would like to have monoethnic or multi-ethnic states are places like the United States or Canada or Australia, where they conveniently forget the fact that in places like the United States, where I come from, we killed off the local inhabitants first, and then we brought in new people. That does work, but that's not something likely to be tried anytime soon in these parts of the world. So again, I'm not here to say that getting rid of minorities is a good policy, but it does produce, or it has produced in Western Europe and now I think in the Balkans, relatively stable states that don't fight with each other every 2 days over where their borders are, who lives in the state. And that's the model, that's the important thing. That model of how to create a state is the model that is in the minds of people in the former Soviet Union, in Central Asia in particular. Why is it in their mind? Well, it's in their mind because the entire Soviet nationalities policy was borrowed from Western Europe, despite the fact that the Soviet Union in many respects set itself up in opposition to Western Europe, to the West. The idea of stableness that should be created by the state and then separated from each other and kept on their own territories was very much part of the Soviet mentality. And it remains sort of the model state in the minds of local people in Central Asia. So what that means is when people, when the Kyrgyz or the Kazakhs or the Tajiks think about what their state should look like, the model they have in their head, the mental map of what a state should be, is not India, it's not Australia, it's not the United States, it's France or Germany or Poland, states with a titular national population of 90 to 95% and then 10 or 15% minorities. Well, all right. So if you say all of these countries in 1989 did not look like they were supposed to look like in this worldview, so what happens? And what makes the comparison with the Balkans very interesting is in some respects, things happen that are quite similar to what occurred in the Balkans. And in some respects, they're quite different. Most important, in the Balkans, the way that monoethnic states were achieved usually included a pretty strong amount of violence against minority populations. And what's more, that violence tended to occur, at least to be related to the fact that there were territorial wars going on either between these countries, among these countries, or among these states desiring to become countries and the imperial or waning imperial powers. In the Balkans, in Central Asia, this did not happen. But what did happen was that all of these states have moved and are clearly moving in the direction of creating the same kind of monoethnic states without needing that extremely strong violent sort of push. So let's just take Kyrgyzstan as an example. Kyrgyzstan has gone from a state in 1979 with a population of something like 51% Kyrgyz to a state in 2012 with a population of about 74% Kyrgyz. The population of non-Asian, non-Muslims, i.e. Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, Germans, has gone from about 32% of the population to 8% of the population. But no one kicked them out. There was no organized effort at removing these people. There were no pogroms against Russians and Ukrainians. There was not even, I mean, there were a number of cases where parliamentarians would get up and say, you know, we should make Kyrgyz the only language of the country and we should stop using Russian. There were definitely, and are still, you'll hear Kyrgyz on the street saying to Russians, you know, go home. But really, I mean, the level of push to get Russians out was, by comparison to like the push that got Ottoman Turks out of the Balkans, was absolutely minimal, and yet just as effective, or you know, quite effective if that was your goal. If we look at just Kyrgyzstan, if this thing will switch, I don't know if it will do that for me. Let's see, will it do that? Yeah, there we go. So this is a chart showing migration from Kyrgyzstan. So you can see in 1990, and then there's an enormous spike of migration between 1991 and 1994. And the blue represents the total number, red represents Russians, the yellow represents non-Kyrgyz others, and then the purple line is Kyrgyz. So what you see is this enormous outflow. I mean, the number is, I mean, it's only about 300,000 people, but this is in a population where the total population is maybe 4 million. So it's a pretty significant size group of people. And they left, again, not because someone said you must leave, not because people trundled their goods into wagons and carried them across the border, not because people, and not even because people stopped using Russian, because they don't. They still, in Bishkek, the capital, Russian is absolutely the standard language of discourse among Kyrgyz, who tend not to use Kyrgyz with each other. So the push was rather small, and the pull was also rather small, because Russia was not exactly, in the 1990s, a particularly successful country, nor was it a country that made enormous efforts to try to convince its co-nationals to come back. It didn't really want them to come back. It had nothing to do with them. The Russian economy in the early 1990s was a complete disaster. So they were not trying to get these people to come back. So there were not incredibly strong push factors, nor were there incredibly strong pull factors, and yet the result was exactly the same. Now, in a country like Tajikistan, where there was a civil war, you know, there the Russian population went from being 20% of the population to being 0% of the population effectively in 3 or 4 years. There, I mean, again, no one targeted the Russians in particular, but with a civil war going on, obviously the Russians felt they were better off getting out of there.
Excuse me, before I talk to you, are there any significant percentages of minorities that they're like Central Asian minorities?
Yes, that's what we're going to get to. We will get to that in a moment. That's so the way I see this, it's kind of a two-step process, just as it was in the Balkans. So what happened in the Balkans was, as states became independent, the first thing they did was get rid of Turks, or people they identified as Turks. And there was an enormous migration starting from Hungary in the 18th century and moving down through the various Balkan countries as they became independent, of people who were identified as Turks, not necessarily Ottomans, but Turks. And they left and moved back to Turkey, or to the Ottoman Empire, although most of them had never lived in the Ottoman Empire. Their ancestors maybe once upon a time had. After they finished getting rid of the Turks, then they turned their attention to the locals who were in the wrong place. So it really took it was a two-step process. And exactly that is what you're seeing in the Balkans. So all of the Balkan countries, or all of the Central Asian countries, got rid of their Russians. Again, and in a very interesting and not well enough studied way, and not studied well enough by me either, because I haven't had the chance to go really dig deeply into what you have to do an anthropological study of the Russians who left, I think, in order to get a feeling for why they left. There's a huge controversy. If you ask the Russians who stayed, they will all tell you, oh, we were pushed out, they made our lives miserable. But when you actually look and see what happened, and you read the newspaper accounts, it doesn't really seem that that's true. And so I can't explain to you, at least in Kyrgyzstan, I can't totally explain to you why this getting rid of Russians was so effective and why so many of them left, but they did. And now the Russians who are left are almost all the generation that's old enough. So I mean, whenever you meet someone my age or older, and you say to them, do you have children? They say, if they're Russian, they say yes. And you say, you know, where are your children? They're in Moscow, they're in Petersburg. So there's no, or almost no younger generation left of Russians, which means that within one more generation, there will be effectively no more Russians left in Kyrgyzstan, because there are just very, very few people under the age of 35 left who are Russian ethnic. So that's problem number one. So that's problem number one is kind of solved, right? But problem number two is much more complicated. Getting rid of the colonials, or having the colonials feel that, you know, they don't belong there, is relatively easy to do. Getting rid of the people who are in the wrong place ethnically inside your country, but who've been living there for generations and generations and generations, that, as we know from the Balkans, is significantly more difficult. And again, I'd just like to focus on Kyrgyzstan for now and tell you a little bit about how the Kyrgyz are doing this. If I can get this picture out of here, and then I can, let's see. Yeah. All right, yeah, well, we'll get to that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, so let's just, if we talk about Kyrgyzstan in particular, that part in the south, well, I shouldn't have gotten rid of that map yet, I guess. That part in the south of Kyrgyzstan that looks like kind of a crab's claw or something that goes around on the bottom of the south. Hold on, let me give me a chance to pull that map back up again. Where did I put that thing? Oh, there we go. All right. I have some Balkan maps which we don't need here, but all right. So yeah, this part down here in Kyrgyzstan that is the southern part of Kyrgyzstan that surrounds that piece of territory that belongs to Uzbekistan. This part is inhabited by now a very mixed population that's probably about 60% Kyrgyz, 55 to 60% Kyrgyz, and 30% Uzbek, and maybe 5% Tajiks mixed in there, and a few Russians still left. The northern part of Kyrgyzstan, from here up, is almost 100% Kyrgyz. So there's a strong divide. This northern part was much more Russified. The southern part, the Kyrgyz in the southern part speak more Kyrgyz, so they feel more Kyrgyz. The Kyrgyz in the north, the national feeling is rather minimal, but the Kyrgyz in the south are fairly strong. And there was a strong differentiation there between what people did. So the Uzbeks tended to be farmers and tradesmen, and the Kyrgyz tended to herd cattle and sheep, which is what Kyrgyz traditionally do. They're transhuman animal stock breeders. So in this new country, with the model of Kyrgyzstan as our Kyrgyz home, the same way as in Balkan countries where Croatia is understood first and foremost as the place where Croatians should do well, or Serbia as the place where Serbs should do well, etc. Kyrgyz have the same concept, many of them. And so this idea that the Uzbeks especially had more economic power in the south than the Kyrgyz did is something that is simply untenable in this kind of state, especially when the Uzbeks make up that large a percentage of the population. So, again, following good European procedure, what you have to do is get rid of Uzbeks. I mean, there's no question that that's what has to happen if that's your model of a state. 35% Uzbeks in this part of the country is just too large a minority population for a state that understands itself as a national state to live with. Now, there are some complicating factors that didn't exist in the Balkan states, at least didn't exist to the same extent, which are that Kyrgyzstan is completely bankrupt and depends enormously on the international community for aid and support. And the international community obviously is totally against the idea of getting rid of Uzbeks just because they're in the wrong country. Plus the fact that the Uzbeks have nowhere to go, because Uzbekistan is ruled by a rather unpleasant dictator, Islam Karimov, who has absolutely no interest in helping the Uzbeks inside Kyrgyzstan. He thinks they've been ruined by living. Kyrgyzstan is a much more democratic country, has been for 20 years. He thinks the Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan are a kind of lost group. He doesn't want them. Even when there were pogroms against the Uzbeks in 2010, and they fled across the border to Uzbekistan, first he didn't let them in, and then as soon as he did let them in, the second he thought he could push them back, he pushed them back across the border again. So the Uzbeks really don't have a lot of place to go, which is another limiting factor. And yet, nevertheless, the Kyrgyz are doing their best to Kyrgyzify the country. And what the way they're trying to do it is really, in some respects, quite interesting because, again, they are much more constrained than, let's say, the Balkan countries were when they did their versions of ethnic cleansing, if we want to call it that. So they're quite constrained. They can't. I mean, active state-sponsored violence against Uzbeks is simply not something they can do. So, and yet, on the other hand, I mean, I spent a long couple of days talking to the mayor of the city of Osh. Osh is the main city in the south of Kyrgyzstan, and the mayor is roundly hated by the international community, who think that they think he is a horrible Kyrgyz nationalist who's, you know, instigating all sorts of unpleasant things. When you talk to him, he's quite aware that that's what the international community thinks, and he basically says, "Look, here's my problem. I have a city that's about 55% Kyrgyz, and if I don't allow the Kyrgyz to feel that they own it, they're going to start massacring Uzbeks. I don't want them to start massacring Uzbeks. I recognize this is a multi-ethnic city. It has been for 1,000 years. I have no interest in getting rid of Uzbeks. But I can't, if I don't sort of put the Uzbeks in their place, in quotation marks, the Kyrgyz are going to start getting completely out of control and running pogroms that I can't stop against the Uzbeks. But if we push the Uzbeks too hard, the Uzbeks will start fighting back against the Kyrgyz." So he's trying to, and he knows very well that he's trying to run this incredibly difficult gauntlet between giving the Kyrgyz, not giving the Kyrgyz enough, which will instigate all sorts of nastiness that the government is simply not strong enough. It's a rather weak government to control. And at the same time, if he lets them go too far, he's going to get a backlash from the Uzbeks, who can't go anywhere. I mean, I think probably in his heart of hearts he would be happy to have a lot of Uzbeks leave, but he realizes there's nowhere for the Uzbeks to go and they're not going anywhere. So he's got to try to keep this balancing act while kind of changing the balance of power to make it more Kyrgyz. And the way he's decided to do it is using symbolic power. So the city of Osh, he's put at every entrance, there are four entrances, east, south, northwest of the city, and each one he's created a new monument in the last year or two that uses exclusively Kyrgyz imagery that is basically a way of saying to the Uzbeks, "Look, we're now in charge here, you know, keep your head down." So this is a statue to Alimbek Datka, who was a Kyrgyz ruler of the late 18th, early 19th century. So he's here on his horse. This symbol here is used, it's on the Kyrgyz flag as well. It's the top of a yurt, the tent that they used. It has a kind of where the smoke went out, and so that you built the yurt around this top. The Uzbeks don't use yurts because they've been urban dwellers and house dwellers for 1,000 years. So this is a very strongly Kyrgyz symbol. And then along here, he has mosaics with all sorts of symbols taken from various Kyrgyz pictographs. Again, totally I mean, Uzbek culture is an urban Muslim culture that dates back to the 10th, 11th centuries and is very sophisticated Persian, I mean, even though the Uzbeks are Turkic speakers, but it's a very, very Persian-speaking culture. He has all these symbols of nomadic Kyrgyz life, and there's not one symbol that you could ever look at that would convince you that, you know, an Uzbek had ever had anything to do with the city of Osh. Now again, is this a nicer way to do? Oh, at the same time, by the way, there were ethnic pogroms in 2010, and about 400 people were killed in Osh, of whom 3/4 were the Uzbek. All Kyrgyz believe it was the Uzbeks' fault. I mean, the same kind of narratives you hear here. You know, they wanted independence, they wanted autonomy, even though no one's shown any piece of information that says anyone really wanted independence or autonomy. So, you know, that was the sort of violent warning, but not, I mean, again, by comparison to the kinds of violent warnings that took place in the Balkans, a pretty minor violent warning. I mean, again, you don't want to ever say that when people get killed it's minor, but again, there are comparisons that to be made, and by comparison, quite minor. After which this very strong symbolic campaign began. Uzbek television was eliminated, Uzbek radio was almost eliminated, Uzbek print publications were most eliminated, names of restaurants were changed from Uzbek names to Kyrgyz names. I mean, all the usual things that go on in ethnically dominating states are going on here. And then in the other great figure that everybody gets to see all the time is Manasa. Manasa is an epic, the Kyrgyz epic, which the Kyrgyz will tell you is the longest epic in the world. I can also tell you it's the most boring epic in the world. Nobody ever bothered to edit it, so it's like millions of lines long. It needs a good editor, but you don't tell the Kyrgyz that. But so they think of Manasa as a historic personage. Here he is sitting on his horse in front of on the main square in Bishkek. There's another monument to Manasa about 500 yards down the street here. And in Osh, they also built a huge equestrian monument to Manas at one of the entrances. Again, Kyrgyz epic, it describes how this legendary hero Manas unified all the Kyrgyz tribes and how he fought off the Chinese and the Kalmyks and everybody, all the surrounding people, to create some Kyrgyz utopia, supposedly in the 9th century. But I mean, there's no actual evidence that any such person existed. It doesn't matter. It's a typical kind of national epic. So again, the public space has now been completely taken over by Kyrgyz propaganda. But there are also some very strange anomalies that you see. The most obvious one in Bishkek is, while Kyrgyz imagery dominates the public sphere, the Kyrgyz language isn't used. So everybody works and lives in Russian in Bishkek. Though more people are beginning to switch to Kyrgyz, but very slowly. So now you have the situation where the colonial power is gone, but the language of, and the representatives of the colonial power are gone, but the language of the colonial power is still used. So it's as if in Bosnia in the 1880s, they were using Ottoman Turkish or as the language of administration and commerce and education. This is a rather strange thing from a Balkan perspective. The other thing is that in the while Kyrgyz has taken over the public sphere, there's not active persecution against like the use of other, like Uzbek even in Osh or the south. So it's kind of a slow motion process, as I said. Now, the same processes are going on in the other Central Asian republics. I'm not going to spend time now. We can talk about that in questions. But Kazakhstan has gone from being, as I said, 42% Kazakh to being 65% Kazakh over this same 20-odd year period. Tajikistan has gotten now almost to being what it quotes should be. It's about 85% Tajik with about 10% Uzbek and 5% others. And so these countries are quite clearly demographically moving towards becoming more or less monoethnic states. And then the question is, will they succeed in doing this without the level of violence that we saw in the Balkans? And that, of course, is difficult to predict. So far, the most important thing has been there's been no cross-border wars between any of these countries, which would obviously ratchet the level of violence up significantly. The state that is the most likely to break this pact of not getting involved to help the co-nationals across the border is Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, as I said, is ruled by this rather unpleasant dictator. When he dies, which will happen eventually, there's no political succession plan, of course. And the likelihood is that the new ruler of Uzbekistan will be much more nationalistic than this guy is. He's still kind of a Soviet internationalist at heart. And so if Uzbekistan were to take an interest in the fate of its co-nationals across the border in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, there would be a real potential for trouble, because as I showed you on that map, those borders are rather difficult to defend. Kyrgyzstan, there's no possible way Kyrgyzstan could defend its borders. And it would be very easy for the Uzbeks to say, as was said, I think it was Dejan Jovic who made that, why should I be a minority in your country when you can be a minority in mine? It would be relatively easy for the Uzbeks to take over that southern part, and then suddenly the Kyrgyz would become the persecuted minority. So that is potentially something that could upset the circumstances that we see currently. But other than failing that, I think these kinds of slow demographic changes, but nevertheless extremely effective demographic changes, are what's in the cards for these countries. And will show, if one were to look at this from a political scientist point of view, which I'm not, I think what would be interesting would be to show, well, normally political scientists would choose all sorts of complicated factors to show why things happen. Whereas here it seems like you really only need a single factor, which is you have a European idea of what a state should look like, and if you do, you will work until you get it, using whatever means are available to you, not necessarily privileging violent ones, but getting to the point where you have a state that looks like what a European state should look like, with a minority population of 10% or less, and then you can go about your business doing the rest of the kind of nation development that all European states engaged in. So that's, in a nutshell, what I wanted to tell you about Central Asia. As I said, I know a lot of other things about Central Asia, which I can talk about if you were interested in that. We can also talk specifically about other things. You may have strong objections to this whole way of looking at things. I've been accused by various members of the international community of aiding and abetting ethnic cleansing and not being properly on the side of the wonderful agenda of the international community. I try to explain to the international community that the reason I'm not on the side of their agenda is because it doesn't work. And if they wanted to actually do good for people, they might come up with an agenda that would work. But again, we can talk about that one as well. So that's where I'll end.